right. Would you take your Bibles with me and turn in them to Genesis chapter 45? I don't know if any of us is ready for what God has for us this morning. I've been a bit dumbfounded as I've stepped back and consider what we've been through in the Joseph narrative. And we still have some wrapping up to do of the narrative, but we're getting close to the end of the Joseph narrative, and not just the Joseph narrative, but the book of Genesis. And as we do that, I have two primary thoughts from this morning's passage that I hope by journey's end you'll connect with and understand and feel in your minds and your hearts and your guts. The first thought is that God's thoughts are so much higher than our own. Put differently, God's dreams, God's visions are so much more vast than our own. That's the first thought that we'll be discussing. The second thought is in response to that, and that is, and God cares how you respond to it. So the first is that God's thoughts are so much higher than ours. And the second is as His incredible thoughts are beginning to be unveiled, He cares how we respond to His incredible thoughts. Someone asked me this morning if I was down because I was quiet. But I was quiet because I'm just frankly flabbergasted as we get to the end of this narrative and as I look back, and a bit condemned for how frequently I thought of this narrative before as sort of I thought of it in a cheap way, a glib way. The verse that comes to mind when I think of the Joseph narrative is from Isaiah 55. Many of you are probably familiar with it. It says this. God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as high the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. My thoughts are not your thoughts." Just consider for a moment, back in Genesis chapter 37, that God gives Joseph and his brothers and his parents these two dreams. That's what He gives them. That's his revelation. Essentially, that's His gospel news for them. He's giving them good news in these two dreams that they don't quite see the end of yet. So He's got these two dreams. He gives them to Joseph specifically. Joseph, in his naivety and probably his pride, delivers them to his brothers and his parents. And the dreams look like this, that they're gathering grain, and they got these sheaves, and all of the brothers' sheaves, as they're out in the field gathering them, gather around. They're personified, these sheaves, and they gather around Joseph's sheaves, and they all bow down to Joseph's. That's the first dream. The second dream is that the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all gather around Joseph himself now. He's not personified as some material item like a sheave. It's actually him, and the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars gather around Joseph himself, and they bow down to him. This is the revelatory message that God gives these people. And what's fascinating to me is that he gives them these dreams, and I want you to see how they, Joseph, his brothers, Jacob, how they interpret God's revelatory message. You see, they interpret it in light of themselves. Joseph is likely a little bit proud in the moment that he's the one that everybody's bowing down to. And Joseph probably thinks at that point that he's ready to be bowed down to right now. So Joseph says, I've enjoyed being Jacob's favorite. Now it turns out I'm God's favorite too. That's awesome. Did you guys know that? So that's Joseph's likely interpretation. There's a bit of interpolation on my part there. But I think the text indicates that that's how Joseph was receiving it. Then you've got the brothers. They're hearing this revelatory message, and they interpret the dream, the revelation from God, in light of themselves, again, and their current circumstances. And they say, you know what? We've always hated that Joseph's Jacob's favorite, and we despise the thought that he could be God's too, and so we want to kill him. And Jacob, for his part, he's annoyed at Joseph too, but he, unlike the rest, he ponders it. He thinks about it. What could this mean? It's a good moment for Jacob. But that's how they interpret the deal. They look at it in terms of their context right now. Joseph's saying, I'm already the favorite, now I'm God's favorite, really cool, everybody's going to bow down to me as I am. Joseph's brothers say, we're annoyed at Joseph, we don't like this, we want him gone, we can't stand this. But both of them are interpreting the dream in light of themselves and their current circumstances. But God's thoughts are not their thoughts. I want you to see how they viewed the dream so I can show you how weak, two-dimensional, small-minded, and cheaply they're interpreting this revelatory message of God. And then I want you to see how God interpreted these dreams and what texture and what color and what depth and what richness God saw in these dreams that these guys over here, Joseph and his brothers, interpreted so incredibly glibly and cheaply. Same message. They saw it one way. God had other plans in mind, as Isaiah 55 tells us. What did God have in store for these two dreams? Well, here's what God had in store. They interpreted it one way. Here's how God interpreted it. By the time the brothers bow down to Joseph, Joseph will have such a character of nobility and dignity and compassion and grace and wisdom from God that he looks just like God. He fulfilled, by God's grace, what Adam was meant to fulfill, in that to look at Joseph was to look at God. To understand God's heart, you only had to listen to Joseph's heart speak. That is where God brought Joseph. So, contrary to what was likely Joseph's thought, Joseph was not ready to be bowed down to at that point. But by the time he was bowed down to, no one would bat an eye, because he was a man of incredible dignity and nobility and compassion and grace and wisdom and stature. Joseph saw it one way. God saw Joseph differently when the time came about. God's version of fulfilling that dream was vastly higher than likely what was Joseph's estimation of that dream, but it didn't stop there. By the time this dream is fulfilled, God included the reformation of not just Joseph, but of his stinking brothers as well. That his brothers, at the time of God's fulfilling this dream, would be of such a heart that instead of only Jacob's garment being torn when Joseph turns up likely dead, now all their garments are torn when it comes to them having to relinquish Benjamin. They all in unison tear their garments. The text says they all got on their donkeys and they all went back to Egypt. They weren't abandoning another brother. They weren't abandoning another favored son. They now responded to Benjamin the same way Jacob's heart responded to Joseph. Judah, the one who sold Joseph into slavery, is now the one that is trying to broker the deal to enslave himself so Benjamin could go free to his father. Do you see the difference between the brothers' interpretation of the dream and God's interpretation of the dream? God's interpretation leaves these men indelibly marked, changed forever. New men. As C.S. Lewis would say, we all start out as tin soldiers, but God wants to make us flesh. He wants to make our heart actually beat with blood. Full humanity. That's what Christ came to accomplish, and we see his Father accomplish it through Christ in Joseph and his brothers. But it doesn't just stop there. By the time this dream is fulfilled in its fullness, it includes Jacob venturing to Joseph too, because he's the sun and the moon with his wife. And Jacob goes to Joseph, and in these 20 years, God used this moment, this dream, this happening, this revelation to take Joseph and Benjamin out of Jacob's tight grasp, prying them from his fingers so that he could release his idolatry of his two boys, sons of Rachel. And so Jacob, by the time this dream is fulfilled, is himself becoming a new man, one step closer to looking like the image that God had for him in mind. It's not just there. The dream doesn't just stop then. This revelation from God also, by the time God fulfills it, included the saving of the entire world. It says that all the earth came to Egypt because this famine was so vast and all-encompassing. So God's version of this dream includes the rescue of humanity, a second ark, so to speak. Not only does God's vision of this dream stop there, it continues that one of the major global leaders at the time, Pharaoh himself, cannot help but recognize that God's wisdom is with Joseph, that God is the true God. But it doesn't just stop there. The whole earth is beginning to recognize that, in that they have to come to Joseph to get the food. And then even beyond that, this dream accomplishes Joseph and his family getting the very best land in Egypt, the land of Goshen. But ultimately, in the end, every single person involved in this drama, in this narrative, at the end of the narrative, can only stand back. None of them taking credit for it. None of them. Joseph understands that this is not about him. God is the one that did this. They all stand back and they just marvel. They just can't believe that God has entered their sphere and worked within the curse of the earth, a famine, worked within the curse in devoting man to his choice to leave God and handing them over to sin. He worked within the brothers' sin and the sin of Jacob and the sin of Joseph. And he weaved all of it to bring about the redemption of the world, and only so that the whole world could say, God did this. God did this. There's no other explanation other than God saved us. This is what God brings about with these two dreams. They interpreted them so small-mindedly, so two-dimensionally. When you look at God, what God brought about through these two dreams, it's just unbelievable. The contours, the colors, the beauty, the vibrancy of God's glory is all over this story. But their estimation of it was so low. Their thoughts in receiving these dreams were not God's thoughts. His ways, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so His ways are above ours. And so this brings us to the place of evaluation. Because, friend, God has given us revelatory good news as well. You see, He gave us Jesus. He gave us His Son. Just like He gave Joseph the wisdom to handle the 7 years of plenty, to outweigh the 7 years of want, so He provided Jesus to deal with our deepest need, which was way more desperate than a global famine. He gave it to handle our spiritual need, our depth in sin. And I fear that just like Joseph and his brothers interpreted the revelation of God very cheaply and said, we don't really know what this is supposed to do, so we can take God's gospel and interpret it incredibly cheaply. I think this is the reason that in our culture, there's not much of a difference between the divorce rates between unsaved and saved. They're similar. How does that happen when God comes into this world, and not just into this world, but into our hearts? I don't just want to pick on divorce. How is it that we can keep getting beat by the same sins over and over and over and over again when God has not just come into this world, but He's come into our hearts? You see, that's a cheap interpretation of what God claimed to have done. God came into this world, came into our hearts through God the Son to bring about the same thing in us that He brought about in the brothers and Joseph. He came to bring about a renovation of the heart. That's what He came to bring about. He came to bring about a conforming of us to the image of Christ. That to talk to us is to talk to Christ. Now, of course, we all fall short of that glory, but that's why He doesn't give up. He keeps changing us. And that's why He gave us each other, so that we could speak truth into each other's lives in love to bring about the change that is necessary and needed for all of us. So we, from degree of glory to degree of glory, are meant to be being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. That's what's supposed to happen. Just as these brothers went through a reformation and Joseph went through a reformation from start to finish, so we're caught up in that cycle right now. Listen to the words of the Apostle Paul. as a result of the revelation of Jesus Christ in our lives. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you. Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. It's just a sampling of sin. It's not an exhaustive list. On account of these, Paul writes, the wrath of God is coming. In these, you too once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its creator. So take all these things off, Paul's saying. Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if anyone has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. This is a reformed community. This is a people who used to walk in total waywardness and godlessness and bitterness and wrath and frustration and unbelief. And he's saying, Christ came into this world to make you happy in Him, to make you joyful, to make you forgive the people that have wronged you, to make you a people of peace, to make your hearts beat with God's heart in all of its glory and all of its grandeur. That's what Christ came to do. So be aware of it. Be aware that He's doing that every second of every moment of every day, and that He's using the evil of this world because He's devoted this world to evil. That was what Adam and Eve wanted, and that's what He gave them. That was a disciplinary measure that He gave them. He said, effectively, you want a godless world, I'm giving you that. I'm giving it to you. You want an earth that's not in submission to God, so I'm giving you that. So you're going to plant your corn later than you're supposed to. And that's not funny. That's true. Our world is not in harmony with God because He made it that way. He devoted it to a godless world. So we have tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes and all these sorts of things because that's what humanity wanted. And God's not doing that in vengeance. God's saying, I'm doing this as a remedial lesson to show you what God out of the world looks like. So I'm going to give you a portion of that. But I'm going to come into the world and I'm going to work through all the earthquakes and tsunamis and deaths and miscarriages and all these sorts of things. I'm going to work within that. I'm going to work in a father loving 2 sons more than his 10 other ones. I'm going to work within a famine. I'm going to work within the context of a godless world to bring about godliness. And I'm going to do that to such an extent that I'm going to send my Son into that godless world. And I'm going to use all the sin and nastiness of your hearts to crucify Him. But in my estimation, it's going to be a substitutionary sacrifice so that your hearts could be made new. I'm going to use all your nastiness on my Son to bring about redemption for your hearts. That's what He's doing. And so He's using right now the cancer in your body, the marriage that didn't turn out the way you thought it would, your children not turning out the way you thought they would in every jot and tittle, your job not turning out, your boss not turning out, this, that, and the other thing. He's using all of it. The person who's wronged you in this church or outside this church, he's using all of it to bring about what we see in these brothers and Joseph and Jacob. That's what he's doing. Right now. He's using the parents that you received in all of their messed upness, in all of their mistakes. He's using it to form your heart in His own image. That's what He's doing. That's what He's up to. Do you know that? We're going to get to, in just a moment, how Jacob responds to that work in his life. Because God cares desperately about that work. But what is that work? I've shared, it's conforming you to the image of Christ. That was the job in Genesis 1:28. He formed man in His likeness, formed man and woman in His likeness, in His image. We are meant to reflect Him. And the question is, how do we reflect God? And the answer that the Bible consistently gives us is, you see Him. That's the answer. Moses sees God, comes down from the mountain, and everyone's like, why? Because his face is glowing. Why? Because he saw God. Just the backside. So the answer is, how are you conformed to the image of Christ? The answer is, you see Him. You see Him. John tells us, he says there's going to come a day where we will be like Him. Why? Because we'll see Him as He is. Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we're being conformed to His image. Why? Because He's removed the blindness so that we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And as a result of that seeing, we are being conformed from one degree of glory to the next. Why? Because we're seeing Jesus as He is. So what does God do in this narrative? Well, like I said, God brings these people, Joseph, his brothers, Jacob, Pharaoh, Egypt, the world, He brings all of them to the place where they just step back and they're like, all we can see is God. All we can see is God. Joseph, the one guy that you might be tempted to look at instead of God, says, you don't understand. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, to bring about the saving of many lives. So look to Him. C.S. Lewis says the best worship service that you could ever attend is one that you walk away not thinking of any particular portion of the service or person, but you walk away thinking about God. It's the best worship service that can ever take place. It's the only thing that'll help you. So this narrative closes up with it's kind of funny, it's not the sun, moon, and stars revolving around Joseph, even though that was the way the dream brought about. Really, the way it all finishes up and all wraps up is that the sun, the moon, the stars, every person involved, the entire planet is now orbiting back in their proper orbit, which is around God. That's the way it ends. So at the end of your life, all you should be able to say is God. Martin Luther, last words, I am a beggar. This is true. That's the idea. That we come to the end recognizing that God was always at work to do good in this world, bringing all of us back into conformity with the image that was lost at the fall, which is the image of Jesus Christ. that we all look like him. That's the idea. I've complimented parents before on how their children have turned out and have been delighted to hear back from them. We had nothing to do with it. It was all God. That's a proper response. Even if God had used you in the forming of that. Because if you're a parent, you understand that your kid's only hope is God. That's the deal. Now you do the very best you can, but what you're doing is you're responding to what God has done. Friends, you don't want your life to be orbiting anything else. Whether that's an activity, whether that's the highest goal for your kids, whether that's entertainment, whatever your lofty and grandiose view of this life is ending here, whether that's a financial status or whatever position you're aiming for, whatever it is, it doesn't compare to orbiting around God in terms of joy. God ministered to me this truth just this last week at Gitchagumi Bible Camp, actually Copper Harbor to be specific. We went on a hike, and we're on this hike in Copper Harbor. It's just a short hike. It's called the Hunter's Point hike. We're hiking on this peninsula out in Lake Superior, and the kids are climbing over all the rocks, and I'm standing back with Esther, and I notice that Esther begins climbing one of these rocks, like really well. And I'm like, man, I can't remember if the boys did this at this young, but like this is really awesome, you know. And I'm watching Esther, and I'm like, you know, cradled behind her in case she fell, and working through it. But she's like this little mountain climber. I'm just like amazed at how cool. And then my wilderness brain and my fascination with climbing and wilderness stuff and all this sort of thing went back to that documentary that I shared with you about Alex Honnold, who free climbed El Capitan in Yosemite National Park in California. And I thought to myself, you know, maybe Esther's going to be the female version of Alex Honnold. And she's going to be like this awesome wilderness chick that like I just love to see on the front of magazines, of Backpacker magazine and all this stuff. And my brain's just starting to go in all these directions and say, this is awesome. And then the thought hit me about Alex Honnold. That here's this guy who every climber that's ever existed would hands down, just like Joseph's brothers bow down to Joseph, would say, this guy is the best climber the world has ever known. Nobody would argue with that. He's reached effectively the pinnacle of the climbing community, climbing with no ropes, a granite face of over 3,000 feet. Absolutely incredible. The only assistance is from a bag of chalk hanging on his back. It's absolutely unbelievable. Everybody in the climbing community would say so. But then I thought about Paul. It's a different context. It's not an outdoorsy climbing context. It's a religious context. It's a Jewish framework context. But within that framework, within that culture, like Alex, Paul says, I reached the very top. All my peers, all the people that I call special, all the people that I respect and would like their respect. So just like Alex had his climbing community, Paul has his religious community. And Paul, in a biographical testimony, says, I want you to know that I reached the top. No one outshadowed me. My shadow was cast far and wide above everyone else with whom I had come in contact. Listen to what he says, his own words, autobiographical. If anyone else thinks he has a reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. I just want you to picture Alex speaking to a room full of climbers, and he says, if anybody thinks that you did it, I'm telling you that I did more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Whatever is in your highest estimation of success, if it's not orbiting around God, if it's not your family orbiting around God, you're not just wrong. You've missed out on the joy. You're not just wrong. You're less happy. You've missed it. As Pastor said, your ladder's up against the wrong wall, even though you've got to the top. This is the deal. This is what we were created for. This is what was meant to make your heart beat and your mind to explode. It's God. That's the deal. You were hardwired to enjoy God. If you're enjoying anything else above Him, you're putting the wrong fuel in your tank. You're in the wrong habitat. You're like a fish out of water, or a water buffalo emerged in water till his death. He was meant to have air as well. You're out of your habitat. If your life, if your family, if your schedule, if your calendar, if your finances are revolving around anything but God, you're not just wrong, you missed out on the joy. If you're plugging into any other community or social network more than you're plugging into your local church, you're not just wrong, you're missing out on the fun. You're missing out on the joy. Let me say, if you're plugging into your blood family more than you are your spiritual family, if your blood family's out of Christ, you're not just wrong, you're missing out on the joy. This is your new community, for better or for worse. We are meant to rejoice with each other and mourn with each other. That's our job. We're supposed to minister and rebuke one another and encourage one another. This is our place. Why? Because this place is meant to orbit around God. And if it's not, we need to get back in orbit to orbit around God. That's the idea. So God, working within the confines of famines and sin, brings about the restoration and the reformation of Joseph and his brothers and Pharaoh and Jacob and the world to a degree. That's God's estimation of the dream, and that's God's estimation of the gospel. That's what the gospel is meant to do. In you and in me and in our world. Have you estimated the gospel too cheaply? That's the question this morning. That was our first primary thought. Our second one is shorter. Now that you've heard God's vast vision for what the gospel is meant to do in your heart and in the world, the question the text asks is, how are you responding to it? Because God cares big time how you respond to this truth. If you're not taking me seriously, how much God cares about how you respond to this truth, let me tell you an obscure story from 2 Kings. In 2 Kings, Israel is being besieged by Syria. And the way that Syria is besieging Israel is they're starving them out. They're not letting food into Israel. And you say, oh man, that's no fun. You don't get how no fun it is. Because in the text, two women just made a deal about, we'll eat my son today and we'll eat your son tomorrow. And they did eat one of the sons. And then the other one wouldn't give up her son the next day, and so they go to the king. This is bad. They're literally starving them to death to the point of cannibalism. And it's in this context that Elisha comes with the news that at this time tomorrow, you'll be eating a really decent portion of food for next to nothing. And that's told to the commander of Israel's army. And I want you to ask yourself the question, how would you respond to that situation? How would you respond specifically to that news? You're seeing mothers eat their kids, and you hear this news that tomorrow it's going to be like easy pickings. Everybody's going to be eating cheaply as much as they want. That's the news from God to the commander of God's army. The question is how would you receive that word? I was driving early this morning to pick up coffee, and I'm driving back to the church, and I line up next in a traffic light next to a Lexus that's on loan. And I see a guy that's really fit in this Lexus. And of course my brain's going, because I don't know golfers, I'm thinking, is this one of the golfers? Out to get his early 5:30 in the morning coffee, he's getting ready for the day. And I'm thinking, man, and I saw the bracelet he was wearing. I thought, I got to watch TV this afternoon to see if I actually saw him, whoever he is. And sure enough, driving past, he turns into TPC, and I thought, man, he's connected somehow. And I had the thought, I'd be curious if I came to you as a 10-year-old and said, hey, in 30 years, Silvis, Illinois is going to be a stop on the PGA Tour. What would you have said to me? You're nuts. Silvis? And I still don't believe it personally. So I had to look up on the internet this morning, TPC. Is it actually considered in Silvis? And it is. It's in Silvis, Illinois. That's its address. And I thought, man, of all the places to have a PGA Tour stop, it's insane. It's crazy. I wouldn't have believed it. You wouldn't have believed it. What does this commander receive this news like? It's news from God's prophet. I was anything but God's prophet at 10 years old, but this was from God's prophet. This is what he says to Elisha. If the Lord himself should make the windows in heaven, could this thing be? He can't believe it. He just can't believe it. So Elijah responds to him, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. What's he talking about? Well, the next day, same time, the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and horses delivered supernaturally by God himself. And they think that Israel has contracted with the Hittites and with the Egyptians, and they think that the Hittites and the Egyptians are coming, so the Syrians leave camp and they flee. And some lepers are out there and they say, man, let's just go to their camp, the Syrians' camp. Let's just see what's going on. And they get there, no one's there, food's there, gold's there, they're making merry, and they start feeling bad and say, hey, we're enjoying ourselves out here. We should at least tell Israel that this camp's wide open. So they go back, the news comes, and the king stations the commander of the army at the gates to open up the gates so that the women who are eating their children can run to the Syrian camp. How fast do you think they ran? Fast enough to trample to death the army commander of the Lord. Now, what do you think of that? Tell you what I think. That God cares how you respond to His incredible visions. He cares desperately. If He says, I'm going to do something amazing, you best well say, I want to be part of it with every fiber of my being. You best not say, are you serious? Whatever. You'll die. God cares that much when He says, I'm going to do this tomorrow, that you get in line behind the guy who told you that, if he's from God. Jacob is now faced with the news that nothing is too wonderful for God. Jacob receives word from his boys that Joseph is still alive. But it's not just that. He hears that Joseph's in charge of Egypt, which if his aging brain is working properly, he begins to put the pieces together that Joseph's dreams from 20 years ago are actually coming true. Which means, additionally, that God is still intimately involved with his existence. Even though he feels like for the past 20 years God's been MIA, God's been involved in an exquisite manner. And the question is how will Jacob respond to this news? Will he respond like Sarah, who says when she's told she'll have a baby at this time next year, she laughs, a scoffing laugh, and the angel of the Lord says to her, you shouldn't have laughed. The angel's talking to her like Elisha talked to the commander of the Lord. That was wrong, Sarah. You should die, effectively. And Sarah says, I didn't laugh. He says, yes, you did. God said it would happen, and you didn't believe it. You're wrong, and you shouldn't have doubted Him. It's not an isolated case with Sarah and the commander of Israel. You go into the New Testament, and Zechariah is told with Elizabeth that they're going to have a baby, and they're old and they're barren. And Zechariah says, how can this thing be? I'm an old man, we're barren. How can this happen? The angel says, because you didn't believe, you will not speak a word until that baby boy is born. God does not take it lightly when He tells you He's going to do something amazing and you don't live in light of that truth. You respond as though it's fake. God hates that. He despises it. He'll have His children wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every one of them dies because they didn't believe Him. So, friend, Jacob is faced with living in unbelief. And John Sailhammer points out that a huge part of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, is isolated instances where you get a picture of how God's people respond to God's truth. And it always matters. It's always a big deal. Everything that's happening in your life is a big deal. If you respond with belief or unbelief. That's the question. These two words circulate throughout the Pentateuch. Hebrew word for faith is hemin. And for no faith or unbelief, it's lo hemin. That's the question. Is Jacob going to respond with belief or with no belief? It's fascinating. He hears the news, and just like Sarah, he thinks it's too good to be true. He's faced with a moment like Sarah in the tent. He's faced with a moment like Abraham underneath the stars, where God says, Abraham, count the stars if you can, and that's how many your descendants are going to be. And it says that Abraham, Hamin, he believed, and God credited it to him as righteousness. He believed the truth that was too good to be true. But the angel of the Lord says, nothing's too wonderful for God to be true. So how is Jacob going to respond? I want to have you do sort of a little object lesson this morning that the speaker at Gitchigumi last week had us do, and it was very profound for me to experience it, and I'd like for you to experience it this morning. I want everybody just to fold their arms. Now I want you to reverse the fold. It's not that easy, is it? At least it wasn't for me. It kind of like took some reworking to like rework it. In fact, I did it this morning in my office, and I said, okay, right arm out, left. I had to like tell my arms what to do. It was so hard to reverse. And I think that's a helpful analogy for what Jacob had to do in this moment. Jacob had been living in unbelief in so many ways. And now God is facing him with news to say, Jacob, I'm still here 20 years later. I've been working behind the scenes. You haven't trusted me most of those years. But now I'm showing you that it's me. And that I'm actually working. And Jacob is stunned to such a point that his heart grows numb. And as he's reeling, he begins to process. He hasn't given up on God. And he says, okay, as God's not giving up on him, mind you, he says, okay, these words that you're telling me, they sound like Joseph. They sound like the magnanimousness of Joseph. It sounds like him. And then I'm looking to the wagons. Now, you may not think much of the wagons in this text, but the first readers and hearers of this story would, because these wagons were from Egypt. These were, one commentator said, imagine like black SUVs with tinted windows and bulletproof glass. I mean, these were the cutting edge versions of transportation at that time. And so it's mentioned 4 times in the text, and it says that Jacob actually looked and he saw the wagons, and it's because of seeing these wagons that he said, there's just no way my boys would be coming back with these wagons from Egypt unless what they're saying has some truth to it. And so in that moment, Jacob believes. He believes that God can accomplish that which he thought was too wonderful. He realizes that God's there, Hebrews 11:6, and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. And he says, I'll go. I'll go. I remember telling you in an awkward text where Sarah and Abraham are old in their age. She's past the state of menopause. They're past sort of cohabitating together. And God tells her she's going to have a son. And so this point comes where she says, I will try. I will go to the place where I don't go anymore. And I'll try to have a son once more. Now Jacob, in his old age, is saying, I'll go. I'll do it. Because God has to be involved in this. And we know that from the next text, because the first thing he does before he goes is he offers a sacrifice to the Lord. Jacob believes that nothing is too wonderful for God to accomplish. And so, friends, I'm begging you to have your orbit be around God in every shape, fashion, and way. If God's calling on you to make your life right in whatever way that is, and you know it better than I do, He's been working on you, wave the white flag. Say, God, I'm ready. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go to the last frontier. I'm ready to do it. I'm ready to go where you want me to go. Whatever that obedience looks like, I'm ready. I'll ask the musicians to come.